Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back in time to the ancient skies of Babylon, where the first humans looked up and began to listen to the whispers of the stars. There were no telescopes, no modern technology, only the naked eye, endless patience, and a deep belief that the sky was telling a story. They did not merely gaze upward, they remembered, decoded, and left behind the very first traces of astronomy etched onto clay tablets that still survive to this day. If you are someone who enjoys gentle, evocative stories with a touch of the sacred, then before we immerse ourselves in that ancient night sky, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly feel that this space is worthy. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Share it in the comments. I am always curious to know who might be stargazing with me from another corner of the world. Now then, dim the lights, turn on a fan if you enjoy a bit of soft background sound, and let us step together into the sky of ancient souls. A sky they once believed was listening. Have you ever wondered how humanity measured time or predicted the changing seasons before the invention of telescopes or even the earliest clocks? Tonight I will share with you a story that few have heard, a tale of an ancient mystery inscribed not on parchment, but in the stars themselves. Imagine turning off the lights, closing your eyes, and finding yourself standing atop a sun-baked rooftop over 3,000 years ago in a city called Babylon. There are no electric lights, no car horns, no neon signs, only the primal darkness and the vast black dome of the night sky where thousands of stars seem to breathe. A cool night breeze brushes past your ears. In the distance, the Euphrates River flows quietly. No one is in a hurry. No one is glued to a screen. People gaze upward as if the sky is speaking to them. And to the Babylonians, it truly was. They did not perceive the stars as cold, burning gases as we understand them today. To them, the stars were living symbols written by the hands of the gods. The sky was where the god Marduk inscribed his will, where goddesses walked upon the moon, and where every movement, be it Venus disappearing into the twilight or the moon rising late, held significance. Was it a warning, a blessing, or perhaps a sign of a king's ascension? In those times there was no complex mathematics, no satellites, no astronomical software. Yet remarkably, with only their naked eyes and boundless patience, the Babylonians began to chart the cosmos. They noticed certain stars rose at the same time each year, that the moon followed a regular cycle, and that a shimmering light in the eastern sky, a star would return after a period of absence. Venus, the goddess Ishtar. No one compelled them to observe. They wanted to see. They needed to see. For them, the sky was a calendar, a map, a messenger of the divine, a silent clock counting the rhythm of the world. And so, night after night, priests, students, and generations of families climbed onto temple roofs, ascending the towering ziggurats, where the city below was but a quiet glow, and they watched, patiently, devotedly. Every movement was remembered, every disappearance questioned. Imagine such a night, moonless, with stars scattered like cosmic grains of sand. A group sits together in silence. The soft scratching of reed pens on clay tablets echoes like leaves rustling. A star twinkles near the horizon. A boy notes on his tablet the third bright star in the east rising in the first hour of the third watch. They did not need to understand everything they saw, but they knew that with enough observation, with enough patience, patterns would emerge. An order hidden beneath the sky's apparent chaos. Astonishingly, the Babylonians did this not merely out of curiosity. For them, it was a duty, part of agriculture to know when to plant barley, when the Tigris would flood. Part of religion to perform rituals at the right time to offer sacrifices when the gods were smiling. And part of politics, because the rise or fall of a dynasty might have been written in the stars. Thus, over generations, the Babylonians created what we now call early astronomy. But to them, it was inseparable from myth. It was an art of listening to the sky. They did not seek to conquer the universe, they sought to understand its messages. This story of the first people who realized that stars were not merely for admiration, but a form of living memory did not begin with the roar of rockets or the glow of telescopes. It began with silence, with eyes lifted upward, and with the belief that the heavens were whispering something to us. And perhaps tonight, if you turn off all the lights, open your window, and look up, you too might hear something. Faintly, but enough to stir something deep within you. For that is where true astronomy begins. There is something fascinating to consider. The Babylonians did not gaze at the stars like dreamers. They looked at the sky as if it were a living manuscript, a divine script being rewritten each night with light and shadow. And their task was not to admire it, but to decipher it. In the previous part, we stood atop the rooftops of Babylon, listening to the night wind and watching the silent drift of the stars. But this time, let us step inside, into a temple made of baked brick deep in the heart of the city, where the flickering glow of firelight dances upon walls carved with cuneiform, and where a very special group of people work in silence. They were called the Baru priests, who not only prayed, but also calculated. They did not just speak on behalf of the gods. They recorded with precision the movements of the cosmos. They stood at the intersection of prophecy and science, and each of them bore a sacred duty to listen to the voice of the gods. Through the sky, picture one of them old thin with deep-set eyes and hands hardened from decades of inscribing clay tablets. Let us call him Nabu-Zer, a man who lived during the reign of King Nabonassar around the 8th century before Christ. He was not a warrior nor a merchant, but a guardian of the heavens. Each night, Nabu-Zer climbed to the highest tier of the Esagila temple, clay tablet in hand, tracking the rising stars, crescent moons, and wandering planets across the celestial canvas. But he did not do this alone. A boy followed his apprentice, the 12-year-old son of a priest potter, silent, watching every motion of his master like a sacred ritual. Look closely at that star. Nabu-Zer whispered his voice, rasping like desert wind. It was not there last night, and that means something. For hours the two sat motionless. No one rushed them. No one demanded a report. Yet in their world, even silence carried the weight of responsibility. Because if a star set later than usual, or if the full moon arrived off schedule, it could mean the king was in danger, that the crops would fail, or that the gods were displeased with humankind. They were not allowed to guess. And so, from those high tiers and long nights, they recorded everything, not as poetry, but as data. They etched into clay tablets, each rising and setting time, brightness, and direction of movement. These records were stored in the temple's library, stacked upon each other like a secret archive of time itself. But the strange thing was, The more they watched, the more they saw. A rhythm. Stars rose and set, moons waned and waxed, and this year echoed something from years long past. The chaos seen by the naked eye was in fact governed by unchanging laws. And from this something extraordinary happened. They began to predict the future, not through blind faith, but through statistics, through centuries of relentless observation. But let us pause for a moment and think about Nabuzer, about the boy beside him, about those bone-chilling nights atop the ziggurat while the entire city lay sleeping, about the starlight reflecting off a wet clay tablet, about the loneliness of carrying a civilization's hopes for divine signs upon one's shoulders. They were not always right. Sometimes an eclipse came early. Sometimes a star vanished without trace. Messengers brought grim news to the temple demanding explanations. And Nabuzer faced one of the oldest, most difficult questions. If the sky is the voice of the gods, then who bears the blame when that voice is misread? That early science, with its inner struggles and collective duty, was not just about measuring the distance between stars, but the distance between the human mind and the divine will. And within that distance, there were people like Nabuzer, like his young student, quietly becoming the bridge. No statues were carved of them. No legends preserved their names. But they existed. They recorded every faint glimmer in the night, so future generations would not lose their way in the dark. Their story is our story, the story of those who look up, hoping to understand something greater than themselves. And perhaps, like them, the only thing we need to begin is a quiet night, a star-filled sky, and a question no one has yet dared to answer. Imagine yourself standing at the base of a structure unlike anything you have ever seen. A massive tower made of clay, bricks, its tiers rising like petrified waves, silent and sacred. It is not a palace, nor is it a tomb. It is a ziggurat, the staircase that links earth and sky for the people of Babylon. And tonight, we will ascend those steps, not with our feet, but with imagination and a listening heart. This story continues with Enlil Nasir, a young priest entrusted with an honor, or perhaps a burden. He has been given the task of climbing to the summit of Itemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, the place believed to be the closest a human could come to the heavens. He carries no scriptures, no holy books, only a blank white clay tablet and a reed pen. Behind him stretch hundreds of steps, each one taking him further from the world of the ordinary. From this height, the lights of Babylon are nothing more than trembling golden specks. The stone-paved roads, the street vendors' cries, even the prayers from the temple below all dissolve into the night wind. Up here, there is only him and the sky. Have you ever felt so small that all you could do was sit down, breathe out, and weep? That was the feeling Enlil Nasir had that night. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what he was about to read from the silence of the universe. He looked up and saw a sea of light. But for someone like Enlil Nasir, the stars were not just points of light. Each dot was a drop of ink, and the entire sky a vast manuscript written by the gods. He knew that tonight he must copy down something, a phenomenon, a sign, something unusual. And he saw it. Venus, radiant like a lost torch returning after a long disappearance, the goddess Ishtar's symbol of life, Death, love, and war had returned to the eastern sky. Enlil Nasir held his breath, not out of awe, but from duty. He understood that the appearance of Venus could carry layers upon layers of meaning, a blessing for the king, a signal of an early flood season, or a warning of simmering conflict in the west. He took notes, not just the time of rising, but also the brightness, the direction, the hue of the light, the feeling in his heart. Everything could be data. Because he was not merely an observer, he was the one who read what no one else could see. The ziggurat was not just an observatory, it was a space of transformation. In that place, people who bore the hearts of scholars and the reverence of monks drew the earliest maps of the universe, not with machines, but with a patience bordering on the divine. We often think of modern science as the child of cold reason. But here, in the gentle silence of the ziggurat, we see a different kind of science, one nurtured by emotion and faith. And people like Enlil Nasir, they were not arrogant geniuses. They were quiet skeptics, people willing to wait an entire year just to witness a single astronomical event return. They lived in paradox, believing that the heavens might send messages, yet knowing that only precision down to the moment could help one read those messages correctly. And you, the one listening to this story, perhaps you too have known the feeling of Enlil Nasir. That feeling of sitting in the dark, searching for a sign, waiting for something to appear in your work, in your relationships, in a decision you have not yet dared to make. And you understand that signs do not always arrive clearly. They do not always speak in words. Sometimes they are just a faint light on the horizon, demanding that you be patient enough, quiet enough to recognize them. The Babylonians understood that thousands of years ago, and they built staircases of brick to climb closer to meaning, not to conquer, but to listen. Tonight, you do not need a ziggurat, just a moment of stillness, and a sky dark enough to see what the ancients once saw, and to believe it is still speaking. There are moments you cannot put into words. You can only feel them in your breath, in the slowing rhythm of your heart, as if time itself has paused to let you witness something too beautiful and too mysterious. That night, Enlil Nasir sat alone at the top of the ziggurat, his reed pen set aside, the clay tablet still damp. He did not write, not because there was nothing to record, but because what he was seeing made him hesitate. Venus. Her again. And this time, she was not where she was supposed to be. To the ordinary people below it was just a lovely light in the morning sky, what they called the morning star, nothing more. But to Enlil Nasir, who had tracked Venus's cycle for years, her appearing a day off in a different part of the sky was a serious matter. Serious not only because it challenged his calculations, but because it might mean the gods were sending a message he had yet to understand. And in that very moment, the feeling of being the translator of the sky, a role he once believed to be an honor, suddenly became an unbearable burden. Venus had always been the most beautiful mystery of the Babylonian heavens. She would appear and disappear like a dancer of light stepping out from darkness, then retreating in silence. The priests called it the 584-day cycle, the time it took for Venus to return to the same position in the sky relative to Earth. There were no telescopes, no modern calendars, only centuries of patience etched into baked clay. And that was what made their discoveries so extraordinary. With the naked eye and the memory of generations, they uncovered a truth that modern science would not confirm for over 1,000 years. But one question never ceased to stir debate. Why does Venus vanish? Where does she go when her light disappears from the sky? And when she returns, brighter, sharper, does it signify peace? Or foretell something about to break? That night, Enlil Nasir remembered his teacher's whispered words. There are times when the sky does not speak clearly. It waits for you to ask the big questions. And sometimes, silence itself is the warning. He looked up then down at the clay tablet, and he wrote, one more day, a shift in position, a changing cycle. Alone, he made a choice, not to speculate, not to conform to the old data. He left a note for future generations acknowledging the change he did not yet understand, but refused to ignore. That was the moment every true seeker of knowledge must face, to choose between familiar assumptions or to embrace the unknown. Venus was not alone. The Babylonians also tracked Mars, the deep red planet that often moved backward in the sky. Retrograde motion, a puzzle that would baffle astronomers for centuries, had already been observed and accurately recorded by the Babylonians. They did not know why it happened, but they knew when it would. So too with lunar eclipses. For many civilizations, the blood-red full moon was a sign of doom, the wrath of angry gods. But the Babylonians learned to predict it, without lenses, without physical models, only with clay tablets, alert minds, and time, plenty of time. They discovered that roughly every 18 years, days and 8 hours, an eclipse of nearly identical nature would return what we now call the Saros cycle. They did not need to know the physics behind it. They only needed to recognize that nature had rhythm, and that those patient enough would one day perceive it. Enlil Nasir did not live to see the day the world would call him an astronomer. No statue was ever raised in his honor. But the clay tablet he left behind, hardened by the years buried beneath the soil of the Euphrates, would outlast every temple. One day, thousands of years later, an archaeologist would hold it in their hands, read the cuneiform lines, and quietly think. Someone once looked up at the sky and tried to understand it for all of us. And if you have ever felt lost amid things beyond your control, remember that there were once people like Enlil Nasir, sitting silently in the night, trying to draw a path between light and darkness. With only one thing, the belief that the universe is not chaos. It is simply that we have not yet been patient enough to hear its heartbeat. And there is a strange truth about the stars. They never stop moving. Yet they are never in a hurry. They follow a rhythm of their own, a slow, steady, unchanging rhythm, if you are patient enough to observe. And the Babylonians did just that, night after night, generation after generation. But today's story is no longer in the sky. It lies beneath, in the earth, where a young boy from an entirely different age is gently brushing dust from a small piece of baked clay no larger than his palm. On it are ancient cuneiform marks thousands of years old. And the miracle is, this is not a legend. It is data. Millennia ago, priests like Enlil Nasir, after long nights of observation atop the ziggurat, returned and carved everything onto clay tablets. Not for worship, not for decoration, but for storage, for memory, and for transmission. They recorded when stars rose, when the moon waned, when an eclipse occurred, when Venus vanished and returned, one by one, event by event, like a secretary of the universe. These clay tablets, plain crude, sometimes just fragments, carry the weight of a silent observatory, a cosmic library made of earth. And the extraordinary truth is, thousands of years later, when modern scientists were able to read what was inscribed on them, they discovered that the Babylonians had described astronomical phenomena with remarkable accuracy, often aligning precisely with the predictions of modern astronomy. One of the greatest treasures ever found was in Uruk, an ancient city in the southern region of Mesopotamia. There, clay tablets detail the movements of Venus, its rising and setting times, the number of days it disappeared, and the regular repetition of its cycles. Just imagine no telescopes, no computers, no Google, no NASA. Only the naked eye and a community of diligent watchers living and dying by the rhythm of the sky. And they achieved what many later civilizations struggled with, recording permanently the most fleeting of things, the motion of celestial bodies. But to do that, they needed a special language cuneiform. Not everyone could read it. Not everyone had the patience to write it. But to them, each carved mark was a touch upon eternity. Among these, some tablets even contain ancient mathematical formulas, not just recordings of observations, but attempts to model planetary motion. This means they were not just seeing, they were beginning to predict. They were not merely describing the universe, they were decoding it. That made the Babylonians the first astronomers in human history, not only through emotion, but through numbers. Yet there is something the clay tablets do not say, something you can only feel when you truly look at each carved stroke, the solitude of pioneers. Imagine a young priest sitting alone in the temple library, surrounded by dozens of clay tablets stacked chest high. Outside, the city of Babylon celebrates a festival, but he is trying to understand why Venus has disappeared longer than usual this time. He does not have the answer, but he does not allow himself to overlook the detail. Because if the sky is a language, then every pause, every delay, every shift must be written down. And you know, those clay tablets, thousands of them, still exist. They lie quietly in museums under the dim glow of yellow lights, like postage stamps of memory sent from another dimension. They are no longer warm from the kiln, but they still breathe with numbers, with the light of stars, long extinguished, and with the tireless will of humankind trying to understand the universe with bare hands. You and I, we may never have held a Babylonian clay tablet, but every time we check a calendar, tell time measure angles, divide an hour into 60 seconds, we are using their base 60 system. Every time we confirm an ancient astronomical event by mapping the sky, we are using what they once recorded with only eyesight and faith. And every time we look up at the sky asking questions like why we are continuing a journey that began on the rooftops of ancient Babylon with clay tablets and a sky that never stops moving. Have you ever wondered if a child from Babylon 3,000 years ago were to step into our world today, into a quiet night where the streets glow under amber lights and phones beam from every hand? What would be the first thing they would do? Perhaps they would look up, and maybe they would cry, not out of sorrow, but because they could no longer see their sky. Long ago, in the land once called Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, before there were rockets, before there were computers, before the word astronomy even existed, small, humble people looked up and asked, "What does it all mean?" They did not merely record the stars. They lived with them. They did not divide the world into the spiritual and the scientific, into belief and knowledge. To them, a celestial event was not just a physical occurrence. It was a moral question, a warning, a message from the other side of human existence. And the most beautiful part was, they were not afraid not to understand. They patiently observed. They carved everything down. And they believed if they were diligent enough, humble enough, then one day the truth would slowly emerge, just like Venus, after a long absence, would rise again from the east. You see, in our time, we have every tool. We have satellites, gravimeters, even maps of the cosmos stretching to the edges of black holes. Yet sometimes we lose the ability to look up with our hearts. We measure precisely, but forget to listen. We explain the phenomenon, but stop wondering about its meaning. And yet, the Babylonians, living amid desert winds and sandstorms, with no electricity, no lenses, accomplished something modern humans often forget. They placed their trust in the rhythm of the world. Not the hurried ticking of clocks, but the quiet breathing of the universe where stars rise and fall, seasons come and go, and humankind, though fragile, can still become the keeper of that symphony's tempo. One clay tablet excavated in Uruk records a lunar eclipse that occurred in the year 568 before Christ. Modern astronomers checked and confirmed, yes, there truly was a total lunar eclipse on that exact date. That alone, a simple match, is enough to leave one speechless. Because we realize that in an age with nothing but naked eyes and trembling hands, someone sat through the night and looked up and wrote it down. Not for glory, not for wealth, but for one reason only: they wanted to preserve the truth. And that is something modern Americans or anyone in this age can still hear deep within the memory of history. When you are no longer sure where you are going, pause and look up. Not to find direction, but to remember that you are still standing in a world with rhythm, with order, with quiet movements far greater than any of your daily worries. And even if you do not understand it right now, that is okay. The sky once waited thousands of years for humankind to understand it. It will wait for you too. Tonight, if you look up and see only a few lonely stars scattered across a city-saturated sky, do not be disheartened. Remember, you are sharing that moment with a young priest who lived thousands of years ago. Someone who once stood silently, clay tablet in hand, heart beating slowly, and asked himself, "Are the gods trying to say something to me?" Whether or not you believe in gods is not what matters. What matters is, you still remember how to look up. And when this story ends, I do not hope you will remember the names of celestial cycles. I do not need you to memorize dates or recite what the clay tablets recorded. I only hope that when the lights go off, when the night truly falls, when silence fills the room, you will keep one unanswered question for yourself. Do not rush to solve it. Hold it as the Babylonians once did, like a star flickering in the night. Have you ever heard of people who lived right beside death? Not just for a few moments, but for years, amid freezing mud under a rain of bullets and a silence that could make your skin crawl. Tonight, while everything around you is quiet, I will take you back to a time when men did not fight for glory, but just to survive another day. This is a story that begins in a place known as the trenches. There were deep cuts across the face of Europe like unhealed scars. These trenches were not drawn on tourist maps, nor did anyone mention them in cozy conversations. But during the First World War, they were home. They were hell. They were where young soldiers thought they would only stay for a few weeks, only to remain there for years. These trenches were unlike anything you have ever imagined. They were not spacious, not fortified, and had none of the grandeur seen in propaganda posters. They were narrow, winding grooves in the earth just wide enough for two men to squeeze past each other. Dug with crude shovels, they stretched from the Belgian coast all the way to the Swiss border, like a jagged wound stitched together with barbed wire. Can you hear the mud beneath your feet? Thick, foul-smelling mud mixed with rainwater, blood waste, and despair. They called it trench soup. Wooden planks known as duckboards were laid down, but they did little good. Often soldiers stood ankle-deep in water. In some places it reached their knees. Their skin would wrinkle itch and turn an ashen gray, a warning sign of what medicine would later call trench foot, a form of gangrene caused by prolonged cold and dampness. Many lost toes, even entire feet, not to bullets, but to the very ground they were trying to survive on. Above their heads, a maze of barbed wire caught onto everything: coats, rifles, even sleep. Below them, mud and filth. Ahead, the so-called no man's land, a barren stretch of earth between the front lines. A dead zone littered with corpses, craters, and shattered tree limbs that jutted out like ribs under the torn skin of a dying world. Even when the guns were silent, death had not gone anywhere. It was only waiting. A soft cough, the tip of a helmet rising above the trench lip, and then crack a sniper's bullet, ending a man's thoughts forever. Sometimes artillery came without warning, as if the sky itself had gone mad. One moment you were dreaming of dinner back home, the next the earth erupted, and you were swallowed in smoke and mud, your ears ringing, your screams drowned out by explosions. The air was always thick. The smell of damp earth, of unwashed sweat lingering for weeks of old blood and unburied death. Rats the size of kittens crawled freely, fattened on the dead. Lice lived in every crease of clothing, laying eggs, spreading itch and illness. Sleep came in broken pieces, minutes here, a fragmented dream there, always ready to wake at gunfire, or perhaps never wake again. And yet perhaps the strangest thing was this: they kept living. They built shelters out of sandbags, scrap metal, and crate wood. They lit cigarettes passed around the last one. They carved the names of sweethearts into their rifle butts. One soldier shaped a wooden crate into a chair. Another found a lost button wiped off the mud and kept it as a treasure. But above all, what kept them alive was not bread, not rifles. It was letters. Yes, letters. Crumpled paper sent from home from a mother, a wife, a lover, or a child who had never seen their father's face. These letters were read like scripture. Read once, then again, then once more. Some folded them carefully and kept them in a tin box close to the heart, as if they were charms against death. Others added sketches in the margins, pressed flowers inside, slipped in a coin, or scribbled a line or two. I am well. Be good. See you soon. You might wonder, how did people survive in such a world? Perhaps it is because they did not live as we understand it. They waited. Waited for the next barrage. Waited for the next letter. Waited for the order to retreat. Waited for something, anything, to remind them that beyond the wall of mud, there still existed another world. A world with sunshine, with toast, with barking dogs, and with reasons to make it through one more night. Have you ever thought that the only thing that helped people endure hell was not strength, but the memory of a hand that once held theirs? Christmas Eve of 1914 arrived like a stranger knocking on the door in the cold, uninvited, offering no promises, yet somehow compelling people to open their hearts. It was the first winter of a war everyone thought would last only a few weeks. But the trenches had already become the spine of a world that was breaking apart. And the men within them had begun to forget what it felt like to be normal. The cold was so bitter that every breath turned into a puff of white smoke whenever someone whispered. Soldiers curled into damp blankets, their backs pressed against the frozen earth, woolen caps pulled down over their ears, hands wrapped tightly around the stocks of their rifles as if a single slip in attention might cause everything to vanish. Some missed their mothers. Some longed for Christmas dinner with mulled cider and the scent of baked pie. Some wished for just one thing to live until morning. Then, something broke the silence. It was not gunfire. It was not a flare. It was a song. Far away across the battlefield, where German soldiers were also shivering with cold and loneliness, came the sound of Stille Nacht. It was not loud, not clear, but it was real. By instinct, a few British soldiers lifted their heads. They did not understand the words, but the melody was familiar. It was Silent Night. One man whispered along, then another joined in. A song in English echoed into the darkness, a fragile thread connecting two worlds. And then, as if the earth itself sighed in relief, heads began to rise above the trench line. Bare hands. No rifles. No commands. In that moment, the impossible happened. British and German soldiers stepped out of the trenches. They walked into no man's land, the place that spared no one, and they did so without trembling, without bowing their heads. No one ordered them to do it, but they did. Amid the mud and corpses, among barbed wire and lifeless trees, soldiers faced each other. There were wary glances, hands that still rested lightly on the hilts of hidden bayonets. But then someone offered a cigarette. The other handed over a chocolate bar, a hesitant handshake, a tight-lipped smile, a broken joke spoken in the other's language. Someone rolled out a ball. No one remembers who kicked it first, only that the moment it touched the ground, every rule collapsed with it. There were no flags, no referees, only laughter breath and footsteps crunching through muddy snow. In that moment, they were not soldiers. They were someone's sons, someone's brothers, someone's distant lovers. They were themselves whole, alive human. That night, photographs were pulled from leather wallets, wives, children, parents. Songs were sung in two languages blending into one. The dead were buried not under flags or with honors, but with a silent nod, because the man lying there might have been a friend if only things had turned out differently. And letters were written by candlelight, this time not with fear, but with hope. Tonight we played football with the Germans. No one fired a shot. No one died. Tonight there was peace. But the next morning, as if miracles were allowed, only a few hours of life reality returned. Officers were furious. Orders were given, this must not happen again. No communication, no gifts, no compassion. The soldiers went back to their trenches. The ball was packed away. The handshakes were never spoken of again. But there was one thing no order could erase memory. Years later, after surviving the war, a British soldier named Alfred Anderson, by then nearly 100 years old, recalled, "It was the first and only moment of silence I ever knew during 4 years of war." He did not talk about the battles, the dead, the medals, or the promotions. He remembered the singing and a ball rolling through the mud. You know, sometimes war cannot stop people from doing what is right. Not because of weapons, not because of orders, but simply because they remember who they are. Because even fleeting moments so brief, they feel like dreams, can remind us that behind every uniform beats a human heart. And sometimes just one song can redeem what bullets never could. That was Christmas Eve 1914, the night war briefly forgot what it was. And for a moment, humanity remembered what it means to be alive. Do you know what is more terrifying than the sound of gunfire, more dreadful than the roar of artillery? It is silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a silence so thick that even the birds stop singing. A silence where the sky holds its breath. The earth refuses to speak, and a soldier's heart beats wildly, as if even it is unsure whether it will survive another minute. These were the nights in the trenches when nothing happened, and it was that very nothingness that frightened men most. Each evening flares tore through the dense black sky. White-blue glows like wandering spirits drifted slowly above no man's land, the dead space between two front lines. Shadows stretched across the barbed wire like twisted arms of the past clutching at the present. In that dim glow the soldiers did not sleep. They whispered because even a voice could mean death. At times the silence was shattered by the scream of artillery or a sudden raid in the night, swift as a ghost and as brutal as a dagger. But then, in some cruel joke, the quiet returned deeper this time, heavier as though the earth itself was swallowing every human breath. During the day, soldiers tried to stay busy, patching torn jackets, warming thin tea with rainwater, burying comrades if they still had time. But at night, with nothing left to do but wait, fear found its way into their hearts. They began to count breaths, days left each faint sound. Some swore they could hear their own heartbeat pounding like a war drum in their ears. Every whisper of shifting soil, every snap of a twig stretched their nerves tight as strings on the verge of snapping. No one thought of themselves as heroes. They were just ordinary people thrown into extraordinary circumstances, and survival was sometimes no more than simply not running away when every part of them screamed to do so. And then, something came. Something no one saw. No sound. No warning. No scream. Just a thin green mist creeping low across the ground, gentle, slow, like morning fog, but carrying death. It was April 1915, near the town of Ypres, Belgium. For the first time in modern history, chemical weapons were unleashed on the battlefield. The Germans opened canisters of chlorine gas. There were no explosions, no flashes, only mist. Then came the first coughs, harsh, wrenching, throats scorched, eyes burning like fire. Lungs, once the source of life, became deadly traps. Panic did not spread through sound. It spread through sight. When one soldier fell, the next began to run, then the next. Some grabbed rags, soaked them in urine, and pressed them over their mouths, a desperate remedy against death. But for many, it was already too late. After chlorine came phosgene, colorless, odorless, stronger. Then mustard gas, not killing instantly, but leaving deep burns, blinding eyes, blistering skin, and scarring souls for life. It seeped into the ground, into clothing, into dreams. When gas masks were finally issued, they were not a symbol of safety, but a warning. Even the air could no longer be trusted. Picture a young soldier wearing a grotesque rubber mask, bug-like goggles, a long snout for a nose. In the rain, fumbling in the dark hands, trembling with cold and terror, struggling to pull it over his face in the few short seconds between life and death. They called the gas the ghost. It could not be predicted, could not be reasoned with. It had no face, no bayonet, only a mist and a final choked groan. Even when no gas was present, soldiers wore masks at the faintest smoke or strange scent in the wind. Not because they were weak, but because fear had become part of them, like a creature burrowed into their bones. From then on, war was no longer the place of heroes on horseback. It became a nightmare game where even a single breath could steal a life. Poison gas did not just kill, it made people afraid to keep living. Tonight, as you take a deep breath in your warm bedroom, remember, there was a time when breathing was a gamble with death. And there were people not gods, but people just like you, who lived, who trembled, and who tried to hold on to their humanity, even when the air turned against them. And their story is not over yet. When you are thrown into a world where death is a given, where every step might be your last, what do you cling to so you do not lose yourself? In the trenches of the First World War, amid months thick with mud, smoke, and silence, something miraculous happened. Not a miracle from above, but from the very ground itself between human beings. Camaraderie. They were not the same. They came from different regions, spoke in different accents, carried different memories. One had been a blacksmith, another a school teacher, another a factory worker who had never left his hometown. But once they put on the uniform, waded through their first stretch of mud, and heard bullets whistle past their ears, for the first time, all differences disappeared. They became one. In the trenches, a dry pair of socks could save a freezing foot, and a shared blanket could warm not just a body, but a soul. Each day passed like a monotonous melody, waking up damp, checking rifles, rotating watch duty, sipping bitter tea brewed from rainwater filtered through a dirty cloth. But in that monotony, something profound was born, a trust in each other. They called one another by nicknames often strange, sometimes cruel, but wrapped in a kind of affection that no word like friend could ever capture. It was a bond that could only grow from living every day together in mud, death, and waiting. In the rare moments when the shelling paused, they gathered around makeshift fires, passing chipped mugs of steaming tea. Sometimes they just sat in silence, backs to the trench wall, eyes lifted toward a sky that reminded them of another one without fire, without corpses. Sometimes they told jokes not especially funny, but the kind that made everyone laugh just for the feeling of being human. They spoke of small things, the bread their mother baked, the dress their sister wore, the field behind the house. One would say, "When the war ends, I will open a repair shop." Another said nothing, just listened occasionally, nodding as if that voice was the only thing keeping him from slipping into some quiet abyss inside himself. Then one would fall. No dramatic music, no cinematic light. just a groan, a collapsing body, a name that was no longer called at dinner. Losing a man in your unit was not like losing a name on a list. It was losing a familiar seat, a half-told story, a mug of tea no one would drink. In the trench, death was not symbolic. It was personal, deeply personal. They did not speak much. They simply stared a little longer at the empty space. One might tuck a comrade's final letter into a tin box as if keeping a promise. Another might pick up a loose button, a scarf, or even the stone where he once leaned. And then came the night. In the dark, everything shifted shape. No one was sure what was real and what was imagined. Some saw figures moving among the wire, enemy or illusion. Some heard whispers, comrades or the wind. Yet they still took turns on watch, eyes fixed forward, rifles in hand, hearts pounding. A single cough could summon a bullet. A cigarette's glow could mean the end. And when they slept, if they slept, it was in their boots, clutching their rifles, huddled close, not only for warmth, but to feel that they were not alone. Camaraderie in the trenches was not a tale of heroic legend. It was the simple act of one person holding on to another so they could both survive. When belief in war ideals or nations faded, what remained was the hand beside yours. War leaves little behind. It steals youth, innocence, and naivety. But from the wreckage, one thing was born and endured: the human bond between people. Tonight, if you sit beside a friend sharing a warm cup of coffee or a few moments of silence, remember this. There were once men who found life in the midst of death simply by sitting next to one another without needing a single word. And that is what saved them. There were nights when the trenches fell into an eerie silence. No artillery, no gunfire, not even a cough. A stillness so complete it wrapped around everything like a thick blanket, not one of warmth, but of foreboding. And in that silence, a soldier would suddenly shiver, not from the cold, but from a feeling. They would lift their heads, sunken eyes, scanning no man's land. Nothing moved. And yet, something was wrong. That is when the mind begins to play its cruelest games. Did you see someone move past the wire? A young soldier would whisper. It was just the wind, the man beside him would reply, but even he did not believe his own words. When there is no sound of bullets, every other sound becomes louder. The distant crunch of footsteps, a snapping twig, even the wind slipping through a coat. Each sound felt like death knocking. The human mind is not made to endure hunger, cold, and the looming shadow of death for too long. Moments of silence stretch like a string pulled too tight, waiting to snap. By the flicker of a dim candle, a soldier would write a letter. Some began with, "My love. I am doing well," though the trembling handwriting told a different story. Others wrote nothing at all, just stared at the blank paper as if speaking to someone no longer living. Many letters were quiet goodbyes, unspoken farewells. No one called them final words, but the writer knew. And if the letter reached its destination, the reader would know too. There was one thing war never prepared them for survival. Not everyone died, but no one left the trenches whole. Trench foot. The name sounded clinical, but what it meant was layers of skin rotting, turning color, then falling away. Some lost toes. Some lost entire feet, not to shrapnel, but to waiting too long in cold, wet mud. Lice crawled through every layer of clothing, laying eggs and spreading disease. Rats gnawed through belt straps, devoured rations and the dead. But nothing left a deeper scar than the wounds that never bled. Back then, they called it shell shock. There was no term for PTSD. No one spoke of psychological trauma. The soldiers stopped talking. They trembled at the sound of a door slamming. Some returned home and sat silently for hours without sleep, without food, without explanation. Some saw nightmares even while awake. But perhaps the worst part was that no one believed them. No one understood. Some officers sneered. "He is weak." Doctors would say, "It is only temporary nerve strain." But no one realized there are things the human soul simply cannot carry forever. Some soldiers bore guilt for the rest of their lives because they survived and their best friends did not. Some came to hate the peace they found at home because it reminded them of those who never made it back. Some lost the ability to feel altogether. Laughter like the smell of baked bread. All of it felt foreign. And still out in no man's land lay the bodies that were never brought home. Not because they were forgotten, but because it was too dangerous. The dead remained day after day, month after month, frozen in their final positions. No one dared to touch them, but no one dared to forget. They became living symbols of the price of every inch of land gained, of every retreat ordered. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone knew there that man had a name, had a story from the night before, had mentioned the child he was about to meet for the first time. And strangely, when a soldier was granted leave, allowed to go home for a few days, he often felt lost. He returned to his small town where everything was peaceful. The lights still glowed, shops still opened, children still played in the streets. But inside him, something no longer fit into that world. When someone asked, "What was it like at the front?" he only shook his head. Not because he did not want to talk, but because he could not. No one could understand the language of war where emotions had no names. So if you are sitting in a quiet room, do not be afraid of the silence. Try to imagine someone once dreamed of a silence like that. And when it finally came, it became the enemy. Because the silence after war is not the end. It is where the longest wounds begin. There are mornings on the fields of France when the mist has yet to lift, and they say, if you are very still, you can hear sounds that no longer exist. The squelch of boots sinking into mud, a soft chuckle shared over a steaming cup of tea, or a goodbye that was never spoken aloud. On the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour in 1918, the last gun fell silent. The war to end all wars had officially come to an end. But there were no cheers, no fireworks, only a strange and overwhelming silence. A silence so profound that many soldiers remained pressed to the ground, their hands still gripping rifles, unable to believe it was real. Some stood up trembling. Some wept. Some looked across the battlefield toward where their enemies once stood. Now only emptiness remained, as though the world had just exhaled after a 4-year nightmare. The trenches were still there, quietly collapsing day by day, like wounds slowly filled in by time. Rusted helmets lay beneath tree roots. Letters that were never sent, now decaying, remained neatly folded in tin boxes buried beneath cold earth. And those who returned never truly came back. The cities looked the same cafes, the afternoon church bells, the scent of fresh pastries drifting through windows. But to the soldier, everything seemed covered in a layer of invisible glass. Every child's laughter echoed a comrade who once dreamed of meeting his daughter. Every worried look from a mother recalled the gaze of someone who had fallen while protecting you. Strangely, they did not speak of war in terms of blood or bullets. Those who spoke of war rarely spoke of war. They spoke of the cold tea in their hands, of a button found beside a friend's body, of a sigh from someone who knew he would not live to see the next sunrise. And from those small details a memory remained. Not a memory of victory, but of survival. A kind of courage with no medals, no statues, only the act of continuing, even with a shattered heart, even when every night brought dreams of shell fire. Sometimes what remains after war is not a lesson, but a whisper. That kindness, even a piece of bread shared in a damp dugout, or a letter pressed with purple flowers and sent in desperation, can survive chaos. That what carried men through hell was not lofty ideals or hatred, but the soft touch of a friend's hand at midnight when you thought you were the only one still afraid. The trenches would eventually be filled. The wounds would someday scar. But some things, like the sound of a forgotten name or the final look you remember from someone you loved, will live forever in the memory of humankind. And if tonight you sit quietly alone in a city without war, without barbed wire, without the scream of artillery, be thankful. And listen, because somewhere in that silence, there are still voiceless echoes from those who once lived, once lost, and once loved, even when there was nothing left to love. They do not ask to be remembered, only that you listen as one would listen to an ancient melody, still playing, and never fading. Some stories do not need a loud introduction. They begin like a whisper in the night, a gentle breeze brushing through the memory of mankind. Have you ever wondered what happens if a musical genius can no longer hear music? Tonight I will take you back to that very moment, the moment when a boy named Ludwig van Beethoven stepped into the silence of the world, and their music began to live in a way it never had before. Bonn, Germany, autumn of the year 1778. A chill wind slipped across the slanted rooftops, carrying the scent of burning wood from fireplaces and the musty dampness of ancient cobbled alleys. In a small room, candlelight flickered across the silhouette of a boy around 8 years old. His fingers moved over the piano keys, not with the clumsiness of a child, but with precision, confidence almost, prophecy. His name was Ludwig, and for Ludwig, each key was a door, a passage to a place where only he was invited. His father, Johann van Beethoven, was the first to notice that spark, but he did not look upon it with tenderness. Instead, he stoked it with ambition. He would boast to the neighbors that his son would be the next Mozart. Night after night, he forced the boy to practice until tears mingled with the sound of the piano. Yet Ludwig did not resist. There was something in the music that made it bearable, as if in every chord he heard an explanation for his own existence. Imagine this. You are a child living in a world where everyone speaks in sound, but you feel with your heart. Ludwig was not like other children. He did not play with friends. Instead, he would stand for hours beneath the church eaves just to hear a choir rise, or press his ear against the body of a cello, quietly sensing sound like a living creature that breathed. He could replicate complex compositions after hearing them just once. He did not need sheet music, because to Ludwig sound was not merely something heard with the ears. It was something that lived inside him. The world began to notice. One winter evening, Ludwig performed in public for the very first time. Expectations were low, just a talented little boy. But as the piano began to sing, something strange happened. The small room seemed to expand. No one breathed. They heard not just music, but longing in every note, as though a soul was reaching out from the very cage of its flesh. But then it began, very quietly. At first, it was brief silences between notes. Then came a ringing, faint, like the sound of waves echoing inside a seashell. Ludwig thought he was simply tired. But it returned louder, more persistent. High-pitched tones began slipping beyond his reach. Familiar melodies became distorted, not because of the instrument, but because of his ears. He told no one. Instead, he practiced more, clinging to music like a drowning man clutches a piece of driftwood. But Ludwig already knew. One day, he might no longer hear the piano. At 17, Beethoven was sent to Vienna, the center of European music. It was grand, glittering, and full of hidden schemes. Yet amid the grand soirees and magnificent sonatas, he remained alone. Sound, once the very air he breathed, now drifted further from him each day. He began relying on memory to hear, rebuilding in his mind every chord, every progression, every haunting silence. One night Beethoven sat alone at the piano. The lights were out. The house was silent. His left hand rested on the keys. His right hand lay on the piano's body. And then he closed his eyes. Not a sound was heard. But within him an entire orchestra began to play. A symphony no one had written, no one had heard. But he knew it was there, and he began to write. We often think of genius as light, but sometimes genius comes in the form of darkness, of loss of a world that vanishes piece by piece. Beethoven's story began this way, not with applause, but with a soft ringing, so faint no one else could hear it, except him. And you, now, have heard it too. Vienna. Late 18th century. The city of classical music, of tailcoats, tea parties, and art salons, aglow until midnight. In that place, amidst the graceful minuets and polite applause, something was slowly fracturing. But no one knew, except the young man named Ludwig van Beethoven. By day, he was a phenomenon. A promising young artist student of Haydn, courted by the nobility, his fingers dancing across the piano keys like fire. But when night fell, Beethoven sat alone, his hand resting on the body of the piano, not to play, but to listen in a different way. The buzzing in his ears was no longer faint. It had become a crack in the wall, once a hairline, now spreading wide. At times, in the middle of rehearsal, he would stop, uncertain if the note he played was correct. Sound had become unfamiliar, as though it came from another world. But this is not a story of surrender. Beethoven did not flee from silence. He stepped straight into it like a conductor stepping onto the podium, even though the orchestra no longer had a voice. He began to touch his instruments differently, no longer listening, but feeling. Each vibration from the strings, each deep note from the bass keys, became a tactile language. He placed his hands on the piano's surface as though it were a heartbeat, as if a blind man tracing the contours of a loved one's face he could no longer see. Beethoven's room was not quiet. It was full of resonance. Each flickering candle reflected off unfinished manuscripts. Scores he wrote from memory, without an instrument, without hearing, only with an imagined orchestra playing inside him. Each note now was a vivid recollection. The sound of church bells from his childhood in Bonn, the violin at a wedding he once attended, or the echo of someone's laughter returning through memory, all weaving together a world where sound did not need to be heard to exist. Audiences back then did not know. They sat beneath golden lights, listening to his music with contented smiles. But they had no idea the music they heard was a cry for help, a prayer, a defiance against fading away. One evening after a concert, a close friend asked him, "Can you still hear yourself play?" Beethoven smiled very faintly. "No, but I can feel every note." From that moment, his compositions changed. They became deeper, denser. No longer merely beautiful or grand, but intimate dialogues with himself. Beethoven began writing the sounds he wanted to feel: broad sweeping chords, thunderous rhythms, melodic lines that seemed crafted not to echo in the ears, but to strike the skin, to pass through bone and blood. If you listen closely, you will notice what rises from his music is not just the sound of instruments, but a soul fighting despair with everything it has. Imagine losing the most precious thing in your life. For Beethoven, it was sound. Yet instead of falling, he built an entirely new language, a way of hearing that no one taught, no one understood, yet it moved millions to tears long after his time. This is not just a story about a genius losing his hearing. It is a story about choice, about standing at the edge of the abyss and continuing to write the symphony, about placing your hand on an instrument, not to perform, but to come alive again, one heartbeat at a time. Beethoven could no longer hear the world, but from that moment on, the world began to hear him as it never had before. And tonight, if you are still awake, try gently touching something near you: a table, the arm of a chair, the window frame. Then close your eyes. Perhaps you too will feel a faint vibration, the kind Beethoven once lived inside. A kind of music that does not require ears to hear, only a heart to understand. If you have followed this far, I imagine you are not just hearing a story, you are feeling it. As if you too are sitting with Beethoven in that candlelit room where sound no longer exists, yet music fills the air. So let us continue to a place where music does not need to be heard, but remembered, felt, and written from the soul. Vienna, early 19th century. The city still spun in its elegant concerts, velvet soft waltzes, and crystal chandeliers, echoing with the laughter of the aristocracy. But behind that velvet curtain, in a small attic room, there was an entirely different world. Beethoven was no longer the spirited young man who had first arrived in Vienna. He had grown quieter, withdrawn, as though the outside world was becoming more and more distant. So distant, it had lost its sound. His hearing had all but abandoned him. And yet, it was in those nearly silent months that Beethoven wrote some of the most powerful and vibrant music of his life. Without the piano as an anchor, he leaned on something else: sonic memory. a treasure he had been storing since childhood. The ringing of church bells in the early morning, a violin's lonely cry in the middle of a quiet night, the string quartets, the folk songs from Bond's public square in years long past, all like specks of memory floating in his mind, now gathered and molded into music. And he began to write, not as one who transcribes sound, but as one who recalls emotion. Each line of music a product of reflection, experimentation, and deep inner listening. Have you ever heard music in your mind, not through your ears, but through feeling? Like when you remember your mother's voice singing, or the first tune you ever danced to. For Beethoven, every composition now began from that place, the inner self. In the mornings, he would sit motionless at his writing desk, sunlight piercing through a thin, dusty curtain. A cup of cold tea beside him, sheets of manuscript scrawled in brown ink with notes dancing across the page like they had just awakened from a dream. Sometimes he would write all day and produce only 4 measures, but when a theme emerged, he seized it like a traveler discovering water in the desert. Loneliness never left Beethoven, but he slowly learned not to fight it anymore. In silence, he began to hear things once buried beneath noise, the deep structure within a sonata, the tension and release of an uneven rhythm, or the subtle emotions woven between 2 chords. He called this clarity in silence, as if when the world went quiet, he finally began to truly listen. And then the music began to change. It was no longer written to charm the ballroom or to please the public. Beethoven's later works were filled with philosophy-questioning struggle. They asked grand questions. Who am I? What is the meaning of pain? Is there something beyond loss? The audience no longer simply clapped. They fell silent. Some wept. Some sat in stunned stillness, feeling as if they had glimpsed a piece of the human soul, raw, profound, unadorned. In a letter to his brother, Carl Beethoven once wrote, "I no longer hear anything but myself. And there I have found a kind of music that defies description. Perhaps that is what true music is. The story you are hearing is not a fairy tale. It does not end with a miracle that restores Beethoven's hearing. No, he would lose it completely. But you see, he found another way to hear and to create. If there ever comes a moment in your life when you feel loss, when the world no longer feels the same, remember this moment. A man sitting in the darkness of silence writing a great symphony, not through sound, but through memory and emotion. Because sometimes what cannot be heard is the very thing most worth listening to. Have you ever stepped into a room so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat? It is not emptiness, but a different kind of sound. Deeper, quieter, and more real than any symphony ever written. Let me tell you the next part of Beethoven's story. The man who wrote the music of his own heartbeat when the world outside had gone silent. Vienna, early 1800s. The city still glittered with the light of grand balls, dance music, and the laughter of nobility echoing from behind velvet curtains. But behind a closed window, among stacks of music sheets and unwashed drapes, Beethoven was living a very different life. He had almost completely lost his hearing. But instead of stopping, he began to reinvent music from the ground up. His room was like a laboratory of emotion. There were no medicines or chemicals, only manuscript paper, black ink sketches covered in scratches and rewrites, and a piano he often laid his hand upon, not to hear, but to feel. Beethoven no longer wrote the way he once did. He was not transcribing what he could hear. He was writing what he believed could touch the human heart, even if he could no longer hear it himself. Each symphony was a world. Some began in despair, then erupted like a volcano. Some began with a whisper, as delicate as the breeze of early spring, then expanded into a heroic chorus that left concert halls breathless. But to create such things, he paid a price. Isolation surrounded him like a thick fog. Friends drifted away, relationships unraveled. Meals alone, evenings spent in such silence that he could hear the soft crackling of the fireplace. Some nights he would rest his head on his music tears, falling not from pain, but from the longing to reach a world he could no longer hear. And yet, in the midst of it all, he chose to create. No one demanded that he continue. No one expected a deaf man to compose masterpieces. But Beethoven did not write for others. He wrote because he could not help but write. That was his choice. And that choice changed the history of music. There is one symphony, Symphony Number 5, you have likely heard it, that begins with 4 notes, da-da-da-dum. Some say it is fate knocking at the door. But if you listen closely, it might also be an echo from within, the pounding of a heart fighting against darkness. That music is not just sound. It is a declaration, a resistance, a way of saying, I am still here. Even if the world has gone silent, I still resound. Do you know what is most remarkable? In that brutal isolation, Beethoven's music reached the human heart more deeply than ever before. People listened and saw themselves in it, saw pain that had no words, the tug of war between hope and despair, the quiet moment when someone who has nothing left still chooses to rise. No one looked at Beethoven then and thought he was happy. But no one could deny he was living every moment of his life, through music, through passion, through defiance of what he had lost. You know, today, when we speak of creating in solitude, working through darkness, finding a voice in silence, he was already doing that more than 200 years ago, alone, with a pen, a piano, and a world slowly fading behind his door. And tonight, if you too are sitting alone, if you are carrying something no one understands, a silent crack within, remember this. There was once a man who lived through that, and he turned that crack into light, into melody, into something that reached millions of hearts, including yours right now. Vienna. The city outside was still alive. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestone streets. Cafes carried the scent of cocoa, and concert halls echoed with the works of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. But where he lived, a small room with a low ceiling, a window looking out onto a quiet garden, was a different world. A world without sound. By now, Beethoven was almost completely deaf. He could no longer hear the voices of others. Even the piano, once the heartbeat of his life, was reduced to vibrations through the wood resonating in the bones of his hands. Yet instead of breaking, he turned that room into a kind of sanctuary of silence. There, he no longer composed with his ears, but with memory. He did not listen. He reimagined. Every piece he wrote was no longer a reflection of the outside world, but a distillation of an entire inner universe. Mornings often began in near total stillness. Beethoven would sit motionless, eyes distant, as if listening to an invisible orchestra performing before him. Then he would tilt his head, draw a line of music, pause, then continue again. Music was no longer entertainment. It had become the only language left for him to connect with the world, the last thread linking him to the rest of humanity. Imagine composing a symphony without being able to hear a single note. Every chord, every rhythm, every modulation, built entirely from memory, intuition, and emotion. It was no longer work. It was a metaphysical journey where art ceased to be sound and became feeling heartbeat and a faint light shining through the curtain of memory. And in that process, Beethoven gave birth to a different kind of theater, an imaginary concert hall where he heard through recollection, felt through vibration, and performed with an orchestra only he could see. At times, he became obsessive. Manuscripts thick with revisions. Some days he would write only 4 notes, but there were nights when inspiration came like a storm, and he wrote for hours without pause, as if transcribing music whispered by the universe to him alone. The symphonies from this period, especially the 7th and the 9th, were not only grand in scale. They lived differently in tense, irrational, reaching the extremes of despair and faith. They were like inner dialogues where he, a man who could no longer hear, spoke to all of humanity. In a letter to an old friend, Beethoven once wrote, "Silence no longer frightens me. It is where I meet the music I once loved, and where I find melodies that have never been heard. For many, isolation is a sentence. But for Beethoven, it became the gateway to the purest space for creation. In silence, he saw the precise shape of every emotion, the fine contours of musical architecture, like a blind architect touching the dome of a cathedral he had envisioned all his life. He once said, "True music is not to be heard. It is to be felt. And when you feel, you are very close to him." There is something profoundly beautiful in Beethoven's legacy. The works he wrote when he could no longer hear are the very pieces that leave the world speechless. They surpass sound. They are no longer classical music. They are humanity, in all its emotional layers: love, anger, fear, forgiveness, hope. As if he proved, you do not need all your senses to create beauty. You only need a flame and a reason to keep it burning. Close your eyes and listen to the space around you. Perhaps somewhere within that silence, a piano still echoes, a whisper from the past, or a symphony only you can hear, just as Beethoven once did. The year was 1827, Vienna. The sky hung gray and still like the city itself, where whispers passed from one mouth to another, "Beethoven is leaving us." He lay in bed, his body worn and fading, yet his eyes still burned bright. No more instruments, no more sound. Only scattered manuscripts across the room, like winter petals that never had the chance to bloom. The small room where he spent his final years was far from grand. Cracked plaster walls, warped wooden windows bent by time and weather. But within it lived another realm, a silent concert hall where his life, his memories, and his passion echoed night after night. A friend came to visit, tried to speak, but Beethoven could not hear. He simply nodded as though he had already known what would be said. And then he closed his eyes. No trumpets, no farewell song, only a spring breeze gently moving the curtain. And in that silence, something was still resounding. We think Beethoven died in silence, but in truth, he died inside a music only he could hear, and only those who have truly lived through solitude, who have stared into the abyss and still chosen to step forward, can begin to understand. His life was not a story of glamorous victory. It was a journey where a man stripped of his greatest treasure still chose to turn that loss into art. You know, in his final symphony, Symphony No. 9, there is a line he wrote, Freude schöner Götterfunken, joy, beautiful spark of the divine. Though he could not hear a single note, he wrote a hymn to joy as a hopeful farewell to all of humanity. More than 200 years have passed. The world has changed. Electronic music has replaced orchestras. Phones ring, social media screams, and we, at times, no longer hear ourselves. But if you have ever stood alone in the quiet of night, faced pain or limitation, and still chosen to continue, then you are living a part of Beethoven's story. He did not teach us how to overcome suffering. He taught us how to turn it into light. There is something extraordinary in the legacy Beethoven left behind. His music does not only live in concert halls, it lives in every brave decision, in the quiet ache of those caring for loved ones who are ill, in the sweat of single mothers returning to college in their 40s, in the silence of unknown artists creating works no one may ever see, and in your heart, you sitting here tonight listening to an old story and finding yourself inside it. You know today's America, amid its divisions, its unrest, and its constant speed, still needs silences like these. Not to escape the world, but to hear the deepest part of ourselves. Beethoven gave us a language beyond time, beyond words, beyond the physical body, a symphony of resilience, of choice, of hearing light within the dark. And if you listen long enough in the silence that follows this story, you may hear it. A melody, very faint, from very far away, but never truly gone. Sleep well, and when you wake, remember that even when you hear nothing, you can still create something that echoes forever. Tonight, as you rest in your familiar armchair, with the wind whispering through the window and the moonlight gently casting its glow upon the curtains, I want to take you back to a distant early spring day, a small secret tucked away in the ordinary, where a flicker of insight brushed the human mind, and the world was never the same again. Not all who change the world arrive with thunder. Some come ever so softly, like a thin breeze drifting through a quiet room. In the year 1879, in the small town of Ulm in southern Germany, a child let out his first cry in a house that no one paid much attention to. There were no miracles heralding his arrival, no blazing stars, no ancient prophecies echoing through the night. Only a mother's gentle sigh, the flicker of an oil lamp, and the very first touch of spring. The child's name was Albert Einstein. The Einstein family was neither noble nor wealthy. His father Hermann was an engineer who worked with electricity and machinery, a trade both rough and diligent. His mother Pauline was a bright woman who loved music, often teaching piano to local children. They had no treasure, no castle, but in that small home, the hum of machines and the soft melodies of piano keys blended together a strange harmony between logic and emotion. And it was there that a young soul began to open its eyes to the world in absolute stillness. But Albert was a peculiar child. While other children babbled and giggled, he remained silent. Some believed he might be mute. He was slow to react, struggled with communication, and whenever he spoke, it seemed he whispered the words to himself before letting them go, as if language was a curious material that needed to be carefully arranged in his mind before being released into the air. Then one day, a day no one else remembered, but in Albert's mind, it was the beginning. He was mildly ill, lying in bed, soft light sweeping across the wall. And his father, like many gentle fathers, brought him a small gift to comfort him, a pocket compass. That was all, a simple round metal disc with a magnetic needle turning gently beneath glass. But when Albert picked it up, something stirred. He turned the compass, tilted, it gave it a shake. No matter what he did, the needle always pointed north. There were no strings, no invisible hands moving it. So, what made it move? What force guided that little sliver of metal from afar? An invisible power, a secret force. The world around him, once silent and steady, suddenly brimmed with questions. That compass became the very first riddle in a lifelong pursuit of mystery. Later, he would call that moment the first wonder, the instant he realized the universe was governed by quiet but undeniable laws, and that if a person were patient enough, they could trace those laws and uncover truths hidden beyond the reach of the naked eye. From then on, everything changed, not outside, but within him. But the world was not yet ready for a child like Einstein. When he began school, Albert stepped into a rigid system where students sat upright, memorized lessons, and repeated what others had discovered. In that world, there was no space for the question, why no room for silence or dreaming. And Albert, with a mind that wandered far from the day's assignment, was soon labeled underachieving or troublesome. One teacher even looked him in the eye and said, "You will never amount to anything." But at home, free from pressure, the boy read. He devoured books on mathematics and physics the way others devoured novels. He did not study for exams. He studied because he felt that something was waiting for him in those pages, something vast, something quiet, whispering through every number. And so, while school boxed his mind and imagination carved out a path forward, the compass needle still spins gently in that long-ago bedroom. A child still stares at it, unaware that he has just opened a doorway for all of humanity. But tonight you know. You are there with him in that very first moment when the question why was asked not with words, but with a gaze. And that was the beginning of Albert Einstein. There are youth that are neither loud nor reckless nor rebellious through their actions. They are as quiet as the surface of a lake, but beneath an entire ocean is shifting. That was the youth of Albert Einstein. At the end of the 19th century, Germany was bursting with machines, industry screeching trains and skies thick with the smoke of steam engines. But in the corner of a small room, a teenage boy often sat quietly over his books. Not because a teacher forced him, not for grades, but because he was truly in love with learning. In that room where candlelight flickered over pages, Albert taught himself algebra, then calculus at the age of 12. He did not read like a student. He read like someone searching for the key to a secret door where light might bend and time could fold. Every math problem was not an assignment. It was a calling. And every solution, no matter how difficult, was a way to hear the whisper of the universe. Yet even as his mind expanded, Albert's soul felt isolated. His world was a silent one, where he could not easily share the excitement of discovering a theorem or the wonder of reading a line that described light as both wave and particle. The people around him did not understand. They saw a peculiar teenager out of place, perhaps even too slow to be called intelligent. But Albert had a refuge: music. When numbers became too dry, he returned to his violin. It was his mother who had placed the instrument in his hands when he was a child. At first, Albert was uninterested, but over time, Mozart's sonatas slowly seeped into his blood. When he played a deep note, sometimes his eyes would close. In that moment, the questions of physics seemed to dissolve, leaving only life rhythm and a rare stillness. Music needed no explanation. Like light, it only needed to be felt. As the years passed, Albert entered the Polytechnic Institute in Zurich, a city more open and free-spirited, far from the strict military atmosphere of German education. He thought he had found his home, but reality was not so simple. In class, professors found him difficult to teach, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he was too stubborn. He refused to accept anything simply because it had been proven. He always asked, "Why is it so?" And when no satisfying answer came, he quietly went to find one on his own. That was the first of many such choices. Albert chose the solitary path. Although he completed his studies, Einstein graduated without a single decent letter of recommendation. No one wanted to endorse a man who constantly defied expectations. While his classmates settled into prestigious jobs, Albert drifted through long months of unemployment, relying on his family, then friends, just to get by. Perhaps you too have lived through such a time, those empty years after school when no one calls, no one needs you, and no one seems to understand what you carry in your mind. It is a period society easily labels as lost. But for Einstein, it was a time of forging. Eventually, a friend helped him secure a humble job at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. Not as a professor, not as a researcher, but as a technical examiner. Imagine it: each day he read stacks of documents describing electric devices and odd little machines. Diligent, precise work, but hardly noticed by anyone. The office was modest. Winters were cold. The windows fogged over with frost. And yet, in that dull routine, Einstein did something extraordinary. Once again, he turned monotony into freedom. Between shifts, he scribbled formulas and ideas on the backs of files, his physics dreams. At night, he walked along the Are River, letting his theories drift quietly with the current. No laboratory, no assistants, no funding, only imagination and an obsession called light. During this time, Einstein also fell in love. Mileva Maric, a former classmate, an intelligent woman with great academic ambition. Their love was filled with logic, but also layered with tension. Mileva was his companion, his intellectual partner through those difficult early years. But that love could not escape the persistent collisions of poverty, social pressure, and the complex inner life of Albert himself. He was both a passionate lover and a man torn between scientific ideals and everyday reality. The silence that had once saved him now became a distance in their relationship. Though they eventually married and had children, the cracks had already begun to show and would only deepen with time. Yet beyond love, work, or daily survival, one thing never changed: light. Einstein spent countless nights imagining himself riding on a beam of light, soaring through infinite space, where clocks stopped ticking and all familiar definitions collapsed. He asked, could time truly be absolute? Did light obey Newton's laws? Or was there something else beneath it all? That question, seemingly mad, would become the seed of a revolution. No one knew that just a few years later, that man would slow down time. Imagine this: a small room with a dark wooden desk, a dim yellow lamp casting light over stacks of technical documents. Outside, the quiet city of Bern sleeps, and behind that window a young man is silently redrawing the map of the universe. In the year 1905, Albert Einstein was 26 years old. He was still working a modest job at the Swiss Patent Office, reviewing applications for technical devices, washing machines, electric meters, automatic locks. But do not let the ordinariness fool you, because in the silence between patent files, Einstein was living a different life, a life inside his mind. Each passing hour brought questions that refused to leave him. Is the speed of light truly absolute? Could time stand still if we moved fast enough? And if mass can be turned into energy, then how many hidden powers lie dormant in the invisible fabric of the universe? He had no laboratory, no assistant, no academic title. But he had one thing: an imagination that would not sleep. And then, in less than 12 months, between the clicking of typewriters and the ticking of the wall clock, Einstein did something the world's finest scientists had never dared to dream. He wrote 4 papers, not the kind tucked away at the back of science journals. These were 4 doors to an entirely new sky. The first paper was a quiet but profound blow about light. Einstein proposed that light was not just a wave as generations had believed, but could also be made of particles, each carrying its own energy. The photoelectric effect, as he explained, was not merely a phenomenon, but a key to quantum mechanics, a strange new world where probability replaced certainty, where particles could exist and not exist at once. In the second paper, he did what no one else of his time dared. He proved the existence of atoms. At that point, atoms were still half real, half imaginary concepts. But Einstein, with mathematics and intuition, showed that if we observed how tiny particles moved in a liquid Brownian motion, then we were seeing undeniable traces of a living microscopic world. The third paper was a poem in the language of physics, the special theory of relativity. In it, Einstein declared what would one day earn him the title, "The Man Who Bent Time." He argued that there was no absolute time, no absolute space. Everything depended on motion. The faster you travel, the slower time passes. Clocks were no longer the masters of the universe, but merely its servants. And then, as if that were not enough, came the fourth paper. Just a few pages long, yet within them, a formula that would change the course of human history. E equals mc2. One simple line, meaning that mass and energy are 2 forms of the same thing. That inside every drop of water, every speck of dust, every falling apple, lies a vast reservoir of energy, if only we could unlock it. But when you create fire, you cannot know whether it will light the world or burn it down. At that time, Einstein was not thinking about weapons. He merely smiled as the papers were published, folded them away, and returned to reviewing patent forms. Outside, there were no cheers, no lights. No one knew that a scientific earthquake had just occurred in a small room by the Are River. The ripple only began years later when other scientists started to realize what he had truly done. Then came 1919. The world had just emerged from the First World War, tired, broken, and yearning for something beyond the pain. And during a total solar eclipse, British astronomer Arthur Eddington confirmed something Einstein had once predicted: light truly bends as it passes through the sun's gravitational field. The world was stunned. Even light bows to gravity, one newspaper wrote. And overnight, Albert Einstein, the man once denied a teaching post, became a global icon. But, can you imagine? A man who had lived in silence, who loved quiet so much he did not wear socks and disliked uniforms, now surrounded by crowds, camera flashes, reporters, and questions that had nothing to do with physics, like, how does it feel to be famous? Einstein's answer was simple, a bit like a strange animal in a zoo, because deep inside he was still the solitary man walking by the river, wondering about light, jotting ideas on the back of a patent application. Fame did not change him. It only forced him to keep walking while the eyes of the world followed. And you know what? When a man begins to see time as a flowing, flexible thing, he must soon face far more turbulent currents, not in equations, but in the human heart. Albert Einstein had opened the door to a new age, but the price of light is sometimes the shadow it leaves behind. There is a gentle paradox in the lives of the great. The closer they come to the truths of the universe, the more they yearn for the silence of a small room. Einstein was no exception. After astonishing the world with equations that overturned the laws of space and time, he did not seek the spotlight. He sought the shade. The 1920s. European cities were still healing from the Great War, like open wounds that had yet to close. Amid the post-war parties, the parades of art fashion and existential philosophy, there appeared a man with tousled hair and a wrinkled coat, often carrying an old violin, Albert Einstein. He had become so famous that no one could ignore him. His face, with its contemplative eyes and cloud-like hair, appeared on magazine covers in caricatures on posters. The world hailed him as a prophet of intellect, even though most people understood little more than three strange characters, E equals MC2. But for Einstein, fame was an oversized coat. He wore it only because history forced it upon him. Deep down, he remained the same young man who once walked alone beside the river Aar. Now he walked through honorary speeches, grand ceremonies, and thunderous applause. Yet whenever he could, he would retreat to his room, quietly closing the door, leaving the world outside. There he wrote, he thought, and he remembered the stillness of 1905. But the world does not let quiet souls rest. A different storm was forming, not in physics, but in the hearts of people. The First World War had left Europe broken and bitter. And while many German intellectuals signed a declaration in support of the war, Einstein did the opposite. He stood against it, publicly, resolutely. He wrote, "I will not kill, nor will I send anyone to be killed." It was more than a political statement. It was a moral choice, painful and isolating. Many colleagues turned away from him. He was accused of betraying his country. But Einstein believed that if intellect was not guided by humanity, it was nothing more than a sharpened blade. After the war, he no longer spoke only of light. He began to speak of the darkness within human beings, of the dangers of nationalism, of the fear stirred by men in uniform who never questioned their orders, of the need for science to be paired with responsibility. He spoke up for peace, for empathy among nations, and most importantly, for the right of the Jewish people to exist. Einstein was not a devout Jew, but he deeply understood the fragility of communities pushed to the margins. And when anti-Semitic sentiment began to rise again, like a shadow creeping across Europe, he knew what was coming. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power. Immediately, German universities began purging Jewish scholars. Einstein, too famous to be quietly arrested, chose to leave. He renounced his German citizenship. He gave up the scientific career he had built in Berlin. He left behind a part of his life. He went to the United States, specifically to Princeton, New Jersey. Soon after, a modest house on a tree-lined street in Princeton became the final refuge of one of humanity's greatest minds. But Einstein did not come with only luggage and books. He brought with him a heavy heart and deep fears. The world was on the verge of a second war. But this time the consequences would be even greater. In 1939, upon hearing that German physicists might be working to develop a new kind of weapon, using the very equation he had once introduced, Einstein forced himself to write a letter. A letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In it, he warned if Germany acquired the atomic bomb first, the consequences would be unimaginable. That letter would lead to the creation of the Manhattan Project, the world's first atomic bomb program. Einstein did not work on it. He was not at Los Alamos, but he understood that his signature, a single line of ink, had helped open the gates of hell. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he did not celebrate. He did not justify. He simply said a sentence the world would never forget. If I had known, I would have become a shoemaker instead of a physicist. And perhaps in those silent nights in Princeton, with the wind rustling through the trees and the soft sound of violin drifting from the small living room, Einstein still wondered, is truth worth it if its price is pain? Within him raged a battle that could not be separated between science and morality, between intellect and responsibility, between glory and regret. Albert Einstein had once slowed time. But now, time simply flowed, carrying with it questions unanswered, and a man trying to keep his heart from breaking while the world around him trembled. Perhaps not everyone wishes to be remembered. Some people, even as they enter the pages of history, simply long to live out the rest of their days quietly among trees, crumpled papers, and the gentle sound of a sonata. After all the lights, Albert Einstein chose to live that way. After the war, America entered an era of prosperity and tension. Chrome-plated cars filled the streets. The suburban dream began to redraw the map of urban life. But beneath the gleam lay the shadow of the Cold War of nuclear weapons, and a fear that the end of the world might come with the press of a button. In the midst of that chaos, in a small town called Princeton, New Jersey, there was an old man with wild silver hair who took morning walks along a street lined with golden maple leaves. He often wore a turtleneck sweater, never socks his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze dreamy as though speaking to something only he could see. Albert Einstein had settled here after leaving Germany in 1933. Now, in the final years of his life, he lived in a modest home with a quiet garden, an overburdened bookshelf, and a worn violin resting near a sunlit window. At the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he worked but no longer taught, Einstein continued to pursue a dream that seemed impossible: the unified field theory. He hoped to bring all the fundamental forces of the universe, from gravity to electromagnetism, into a single, simple, beautiful equation, a foundational rhythm beneath everything. For Einstein, this was not merely scientific ambition. It was a nearly spiritual longing to uncover the secret harmony of the universe. But the times had changed. Science had shifted toward a new direction: quantum mechanics, with its randomness probabilities, and Schrödinger's cats, both alive and dead. Einstein never denied its value, but he could not accept that the universe might be playing dice. God does not play dice with the universe, he once said. But more and more he found himself alone in that belief. Still, he did not complain. He simply smiled gently and kept writing. On some mornings, he would sit at his desk, sunlight touching his hair white as snow, and his pen would trace mathematical symbols across yellowed pages, the remnants of a conversation between a human and the infinite. Beyond science, Einstein devoted more time to the things he had once overlooked in his youth: justice, human rights, compassion. He compared racial segregation in America to what Jewish people had suffered in Europe. He spoke publicly in support of the civil rights movement, wrote letters to black leaders, and urged the United States government to confront injustice. For Einstein, intellect without compassion was simply another cold form of blindness. In Princeton, he became part of the scenery. Locals saw him as a kind, slightly eccentric old man. Children liked to approach him, not because they knew who he was, but because he often smiled, gently handed out candy, or softly patted their heads like a grandfather from a fairy tale. He liked the feeling of being forgotten, at least for a few moments, because most of the time he was still Einstein, the man who had paved the way for the atomic bomb, the man who made light a witness to curved space, the man the whole world spoke of who only wanted a quiet moment by the window with a cup of tea and an unfinished sonata. And then, on a morning in April 1955, just as cherry blossoms bloomed outside, Einstein collapsed from an abdominal aortic aneurysm. He was taken to the hospital. Doctors proposed surgery. Einstein shook his head gently. "I have done my share. It is time to go. No regret, no fear. Just a current, and he, like a speck of light, let himself drift with it." The next morning, he passed away in his sleep. On his desk were unfinished pages, equations for a dream that would never be complete. There was no grand funeral. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered in secret as he had wished. No grave, no monument. I belong to the universe, not to any one place. Tonight, as you look up at the sky, perhaps one star you see appears slightly out of place, not because the telescope is wrong, but because its light, just as Einstein once predicted, has been bent by gravity. He is gone. But his legacy still curves around us in technology, in thought, in the way we ask the question, why? And in the simplest of things, a slow walk through a park, a single note drifting from a nearby room, a child silently staring at the needle of a compass. Einstein, the traveler with light, may still be smiling somewhere in the gentle curve of time. They say that even when he was too weak to speak, he still wrote. His final symbols were scrawled onto a crumpled piece of paper by his bedside. No one has ever fully deciphered them. Perhaps he himself no longer had time to complete it. But that did not matter, because that was not the legacy. The true legacy was how he lived, how he asked questions. From the time he was a quiet boy in Ulm, endlessly turning the little compass his father gave him, Einstein had always been drawn toward the invisible. Not because he wanted to prove something, but because he could not bear the silence of unnamed mysteries. He did not live to become a genius. He lived to become a person who could doubt, who could fear, who could feel pain, and who could love this world even in its confusion and chaos. He once said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious." And that is what he left us, not just equations, but that gaze, the gaze that knew how to wonder. The 20th century was an age of leaps. Humanity flew for the first time, split the atom, saw the Earth from space. But it was also the first time humankind destroyed itself en masse with atomic bombs, a door that Einstein helped open and then spent the rest of his life knocking on the heart of the world, pleading that it never cross that threshold again. Imagination is more important than knowledge, he said, and then lived as if that were gospel. But his imagination was not to invent another world. It was to save this one from its own indifference. He was once called the last genius of the Romantic era, a scientist with the soul of a poet. In Princeton, people often saw him walking alone, his hair wild, his coat wrinkled, his eyes distant, as if in conversation with an idea only he could hear. Children adored him not because they knew who he was, but because he always carried candy in his pockets. Adults respected him, but few understood the loneliness of a man who could see too far. When offered the presidency of Israel, he declined with a line both simple and aching. "I know how to run equations, but I do not know how to deal with people." And perhaps that was his greatest sorrow. He could understand the universe, but he was helpless before prejudice, war, and human fear. On the final night, there was no great noise, no flash of light, only a breeze passing through the curtains. As if the universe, after all his years of searching, had finally stopped by, not to take him away, but to whisper, "Thank you." In his final years, he remained devoted to an unfinished dream, the unified field theory, where all fundamental forces of nature would merge into one equation, where order would answer chaos. He never completed it, but he never felt he had failed. Because to Einstein, the journey was always more important than the destination. And then he was gone. No cries, no life prolonged by tubes or immortal ambitions. He allowed himself to return to the cosmos, like a final note sustained and fading into silence. Not because it ended, but because everything that mattered had already been said through the way he lived. Today, when we look at the night sky, we may sense something very small, yet very real. Einstein never truly left. He does not live in statues, textbooks, or museums. He lives in the first question a child dares to ask while looking up at the stars. He lives in the perseverance of someone wrestling with an equation no one has solved. He lives in every soul who has ever dared to believe that this world, despite its chaos, is still worth loving, if only we are willing to look deeper. Now close your eyes. Imagine standing with Einstein on a small wooden bridge in Princeton. The moon has just risen. The breeze is soft. He looks to the sky holding the edge of his old coat, and he says, without turning back, "The mysterious is the most beautiful thing we can experience. It is the source of all true art and science. Then he walks on, a small silhouette, a great soul. The universe spins on. Beneath the stars, someone perhaps you begins a new question, and the story never truly ends. It is simply silence and melody, like the final poem of a man who once heard the voice of the universe with his heart.